For nearly a century, the Israel-Palestine conflict has torn the Middle East apart, reshaping borders, politics, and lives. Empires have fallen, nations have risen, and countless wars have been fought. Yet peace remains as distant as ever. At the center of this long and bloody struggle, Israel, the only Jewish state in the world, surrounded by hostility and uncertainty. Its existence has sparked wars, filled alliances, and drawn in global superpowers. But what if Israel had never existed? What if the state that has defined so much of modern Middle Eastern history was never created? Would the region be any closer to peace? Or would different forces have taken its place in the century-long conflict? In this video, I'll take you through an alternative reality with fictional factions, leaders, wars, and events that occur if Israel had never existed. Before I get into it, I do understand this is a tough subject with a lot of complexities and heated public discourse, so please keep in mind this is purely a fictional exploration meant to illustrate an alternative scenario for educational purposes and is not based on real events. Now, let's set the stage with real events, starting with the British Mandate. After the Ottoman Empire collapsed in World War I, the region of Palestine came under British control. The League of Nations handed Britain the mandate for Palestine in 1920, charging them with managing the land and balancing the conflicting aspirations of the Jewish and Arab populations. In 1917, before Britain had even secured control, it issued the Balfour Declaration, committing to the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This promise, made without consulting the Arab population already living there, set the stage for deep-rooted tensions. Initially, Britain allowed waves of Jewish immigrants to settle in Palestine, particularly as European anti-Semitism worsened through the 1920s and 30s. But with each wave of Jewish immigration, Arab unrest grew. Land purchases and increased Jewish presence threatened the Arab majority, and tensions escalated quickly. By the 1930s, Palestine was a land of protests, riots, and strikes, as the Arab population resisted what they saw as British complicity in their dispossession. Faced with growing unrest, Britain retreated from its commitment. The 1939 White Paper capped Jewish immigration, attempting to appease Arab leaders and restore balance. Yet, this attempt came too late. The region was already boiling over, and World War II only worsened the situation. After the war, Britain was a weakened empire, financially drained and losing its grip on its colonies. In Palestine, British troops faced constant violence, unable to maintain order as Jewish paramilitary groups fought not only for land but for independence, while Arab leaders rejected any compromise that could lead to a Jewish state. Realizing the situation was untenable, Britain looked to the newly formed United Nations for a solution. In reality, this led to the 1947 UN Partition Plan, the creation of Israel in 1948, and a subsequent Arab-Israeli war. But in this alternate reality, instead of partitioning the land or allowing the establishment of a Jewish state, Britain succumbs to the overwhelming pressure of Arab leaders. They closed the doors to Jewish immigration entirely, leaving Jewish communities in Palestine isolated and vulnerable. Now, a lot of the real events currently happening in Israel and Palestine were used as reference points in creating this alternate history. One of the best resources I used for this episode was Ground News, an app and website that compiles thousands of news articles into one place to give you the complete picture. They have become invaluable for me because they make it easy to see how different media sources frame the same events. For example, their bias comparison tool shows how left-leaning and right-leaning outlets report on the Gaza conflict, giving you a complete picture of the narratives being spun. I've been a user for years now, and I genuinely think you'd love their platform as well, which you can check out at ground.news/dingo. With Ground News, you can see how different sources cover the same story and where each outlet leans politically. Take this article on Qatar suspending its mediation efforts between Israel and Hamas. Ground News has gathered over 400 sources covering this topic, showing us which ones lean left, right, or stay center, and easily lets us compare their narratives. For example, some left-leaning sources highlight US pressure on Qatar, while others focus on the frustration over stalled negotiations, showing just how diverse coverage can be. If you value unbiased news and getting the full picture, head to ground.news/dingo or scan the QR code on screen to get started. You can join for less than $1 a month or use my link in the description to get 50% off the unlimited access Vantage plan that I use. Thanks to Ground News for sponsoring this video. Now, let's jump back in. Faced with increased increased violence and the defeat of their paramilitaries, many Jews flee Palestine for Europe, America, or even Latin America. But some remain trapped in a hostile environment. The cracks begin to form as the British step away, and the Arab League fails to agree on how to govern Palestine. What was meant to be a united Arab-controlled land quickly devolves into a battlefield. Once the British leave, it doesn't take long for the Arab states, who had once vowed cooperation, to turn on each other. Egypt, ever calculating, sets its sights on Gaza and the southern territories. From a strategic perspective, Gaza offers a perfect foothold along the Mediterranean, a prize too valuable to leave unclaimed. Egyptian forces march in swiftly, establishing a military presence, fortifying Gaza City, and ensuring control of the coastal region. Egypt has no intention of sharing power here. Gaza becomes a buffer zone between Egypt and the chaos unfolding across Palestine. Meanwhile, Jordan, with its eyes set on both territory and history, moves to annex the West Bank and secure Jerusalem. The religious and political significance of Jerusalem is not lost on Jordan's king, who envisions expanding Jordanian influence throughout this ancient city. With swift precision, Jordan's army sweeps into the West Bank, establishing control over cities like Ramallah, Nablus, and Jenin. While Palestinian leaders protest, the Jordanians have bigger ambitions. They see themselves as the rightful rulers of Palestine's heartland. With Egypt already entrenched in Gaza, the rest of the southern region, including key cities like Jaffa or Tel Aviv, Ramla and Lod, teeters on the edge of anarchy. In this uncertain atmosphere, local Palestinian leaders and former officials within the Arab League recognize the need for some sort of governance to prevent complete disintegration. Thus, the Palestinian Union for Self-Governance, or the PUSG, begins to take shape. Born out of necessity rather than a grand vision, the PUSG represents a loose coalition of southern Palestinian leaders who band together to exert control over the remaining territories. Initially, the PUSG lacks the strength or structure of a traditional government. Instead, it operates more as a collective of influential leaders, attempting to keep the southern territories from falling into chaos. While Egypt firmly holds Gaza, the PUSG begins to consolidate power further north, particularly in Jaffa, which soon emerges as the capital of their fledgling administration. Jaffa, with its access to the Mediterranean, becomes a critical economic and political center for the PUSG. However, their control over the region is tenuous, and their rise to power is marked by frequent struggles with local militias and warlords, who operate independently of the central authority. The PUSG's hold on southern Palestine is shaky from the outset. Internal divisions plague the movement as competing factions within the leadership vie for influence. Some advocate for closer ties with Western powers, hoping that diplomatic and financial support from the outside world would stabilize the region. Others push for a more radical approach, seeing this moment as an opportunity to establish a fully independent Palestinian state free from foreign influence. These internal debates weaken the PUSG's ability to present a united front, further complicating their efforts to govern. At first, the PUSG struggles to impose its will across southern Palestine. While Jaffa and Ramla fall under their nominal control, the PUSG lacks the military strength and resources to fully pacify the region. Rival militias and local warlords continue to challenge their authority, especially in rural areas. Corruption seeps into the administration, with some leaders using their newfound powers to enrich themselves rather than build a stable governance structure. Despite these challenges, the PUSG gradually becomes the de facto governing body of southern Palestine. They establish a fragile bureaucracy based in Jaffa, attempting to offer basic services to the population. However, their control remains fragmented. Southern territories under the PUSG are far from unified, and poverty and infrastructure collapse becomes defining features of the region. What little economic activity exists is centered around Jaffa, but the rest of southern Palestine struggles to recover from years of unrest. The PUSG begins to build relationships with neighboring states, including Egypt, although tensions with Cairo are never far below the surface. Gaza, under Egyptian control, remains a militarized zone, with the Egyptian forces maintaining a strong presence along the border. The PUSG leadership, recognizing the strategic importance of maintaining ties with Egypt, treads carefully, attempting to avoid any direct confrontation while seeking to maintain some autonomy over the remaining southern territories. Syria, on the other hand, distrustful of both Egypt and Jordan, stakes its claim in the north. The Golan Heights and northern Palestine offer the perfect buffer between Syria and its southern rivals. But Syria is not content with just territory. It begins quietly funding and arming a powerful new faction, the Al-Rasala Front, or the ARF. This group is composed of hardline Shia militants and local militias left in the region, while being backed by the USSR. It soon emerges as a dominant power in northern Palestine, launching attacks on both Jordanian forces and the fragmented Palestinian groups to the south. The ARF uniquely draws on Shia immigrants fleeing from conflicts in other regions, creating a growing base of Shia communities in northern Palestine, where Shia Islam slowly starts growing. Haifa becomes the ARF's capital and central stronghold, from which it extends its influence across the north. Resembling a proto-Hezbollah, the ARF is well armed thanks to a steady flow of resources from Syria, with additional military support from the USSR. Under the ARF's leadership, Tulkarm and Qalqilia also become critical strongholds, fortifying the northern territory and ensuring a steady flow of Shia immigrants to further bolster their ranks. Unlike the bickering Arab states, the ARF rejects the notion of a unified central Arab government, viewing it as too weak to fulfill the vision of Palestinian independence. Instead, they pursue their goals through guerrilla warfare, launching raids against both Jordanian forces in the West Bank and the struggling PUSG forces to the south. The ARF's tactics are ruthless but effective, slowly expanding their control over northern Palestine and turning it into a fortified region under militant Shia rule. The region's infrastructure is minimal, but the ARF prioritizes their military over development, solidifying their control over the north. Before we move on to the next part, if you're enjoying this video so far, please remember to hit that subscribe button and help me get to my goal of 40,000 subscribers by the end of the year. As the 1960s begin, the geopolitical landscape in Palestine becomes more entrenched, with the various factions solidifying their control over their respective territories. The PUSG in southern Palestine finally gains recognition from the UN as the legitimate governing body of the southern territories. This recognition is heavily supported by Western powers, who see the PUSG as a potential bulwark against Soviet influence in the region. The PUSG's seat in Jaffa becomes a diplomatic hub, with foreign delegations visiting in an attempt to stabilize the fragmented region. Throughout the Cold War, the conflicts in Palestine become deeply entangled in the global struggle between the US and the USSR. The ARF, entrenched in the north, continues to receive arms and support from the Soviet Union, which views the ARF as a key asset in its strategy to weaken Western influence in the Middle East. With Syria acting as an intermediary, the ARF's military capabilities grow significantly. Soviet weapons flow into northern Palestine, turning the region into a heavily militarized zone. The PUSG, on the other hand, remains heavily reliant on the West for military and economic aid. The United States and France provide the PUSG with arms, training, and financial support in an effort to counter the growing influence of the ARF. However, the internal divisions and corruption make it difficult to effectively manage these resources. Despite Western backing, southern Palestine remains underdeveloped, with most of its resources being funneled into military efforts to hold back the ARF's advances. As the Cold War continues, southern Palestine becomes a proxy battleground between the US and the USSR. Conflicts between the PUSG and the ARF erupt multiple times, drawing in Jordanian and Egyptian forces on one side and the Soviet-backed militias on the other. Despite the massive loss of life and destruction, neither side can achieve a decisive victory, and the conflicts largely end in stalemates. Syria and Egypt maintain their involvement due to their own strategic interests in Palestine. Syria sees the ARF as a crucial ally to counterbalance Jordan and Egypt, while Egypt supports the PUSG to curb Shia influence and ensure its grip on Gaza remains firm. The landscape changes dramatically in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution. With the rise of Ayatollah Khomeini and the establishment of an Islamic Republic, Iran begins to export its Shia ideology across the Middle East. The ARF, a growingly Shia militant group, quickly becomes one of the primary recipients of Iranian support. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, or the IRGC, establishes close ties with the ARF, providing arms, training, and financial backing. The influence of Iran transforms the ARF from a localized militant group into a formidable Shia military force in northern Palestine. With Iranian backing, the ARF now has the resources to escalate its conflict with the PUSG and challenge Jordanian control of the West Bank more directly. This marks the beginning of a more aggressive phase in the conflict, setting the stage for full-scale wars in the coming decade. By the 1970s, the last remnants of the Jewish population in both the north and south have entirely vanished. The rising tide of militancy and violence leaves little room for Jewish communities to survive. Many had already fled during the earlier waves of conflict, while those who remained faced increasing hostility. In the ARF-controlled north, any Jewish communities are driven out or eliminated, and in southern Palestine, those who had sought to stay were forced to emigrate due to rising Sunni militancy and the PUSG's inability to protect them. The sectarian divide between the Shia North and Sunni South also deepened as Shia immigrants from Iran, Lebanon, and Iraq move into northern Palestine, while the PUSG becomes more entrenched in Sunni politics, which adds to internal fractures within its leadership. By the early 1980s, the wars between northern Palestine, or the ARF, and southern Palestine, run by the PUSG, erupt into full-scale conflicts. The first full-scale war breaks out in 1982, when the ARF, emboldened by new Iranian arms and funding, launches a major offensive against the ARF targets key cities like Ramla and Lod, attempting to expand its control into southern Palestine. The PUSG, supported by Jordanian and Egyptian forces, fights back fiercely, but the ARF's guerrilla tactics and well-trained militias make the conflict brutal and costly. The war drags on for months, but ultimately ends in a stalemate, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. The war devastates both northern and southern Palestine. Infrastructure on both sides is left in ruins, with cities like Jaffa and Haifa bearing the brunt of the fighting. Poverty and displacement become rampant as both regions struggle to rebuild. The ARF, despite its failure to capture significant southern territories, consolidates its control over the north and begins to implement Shia Islamism more thoroughly in the areas under its control. The fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s further complicates the regional dynamics. With the collapse of their Soviet backers, the ARF faces a brief moment of uncertainty. However, Iran quickly steps in to fill the gap left by the USSR, ensuring that the ARF remains a powerful force in northern Palestine. Benefiting from Western dominance in the post-Cold War era, sees an influx of Western aid during the 1990s, but corruption continues to prevent the southern territories from stabilizing. Despite the support, southern Palestine's infrastructure remains in disrepair, and the PUSG struggles to rebuild its cities and provide for its population. The West Bank, under Jordanian control, remains the only part of the region where Jewish visitors are allowed to return, albeit in small numbers and under heavy security. Jordan continues to tolerate and protect the Christian population in areas they control. Christian communities in Bethlehem and Ramallah benefit from Jordanian policies that encourage religious tourism, helping the region's economy grow despite the ongoing conflict in the north and the south. However, in Gaza, under Egyptian control, and in southern Palestine, Christians find themselves increasingly marginalized. By the 1990s, very few Christians remain in southern Palestine, while facing mounting pressure from Sunni factions within the PUSG. As the 2000s begin, the division between northern Palestine, southern Palestine, and the West Bank under Jordanian control becomes more pronounced, with each region developing or stagnating in its own way. The geopolitical dynamics of the broader Middle East continue to shape the future of these factions, especially as new conflicts emerge and the balance of power shifts. In the early 2000s, northern Palestine remains firmly under the control of the Al-Rasala Front, or the ARF. The ARF continues to be heavily backed by Iran and Syria, with additional support coming from the remnants of Russian influence in the region. The Shia majority population in northern Palestine solidifies its identity under the ARF's leadership, and Haifa remains the capital of this militarized enclave. However, the outbreak of the Syrian civil war in 2011 changes the ARF's focus. With Hezbollah absent from this alternate history, the ARF assumes a similar role as a key Shia militant group in the region. Iran funnels additional resources to the ARF, encouraging it to take an active part in the war to support the Assad regime in Syria. The ARF sends thousands of fighters into Syria, engaging in brutal campaigns alongside Iranian-backed militias and Syrian forces. This new front stretches the ARF's resources, but bolsters its regional influence, as it becomes one of the most powerful Shia militant forces in the Middle East. Despite its role in the Syrian civil war, northern Palestine remains impoverished and war-torn. The region sees little economic development as the ARF continues to prioritize military objectives over infrastructure or public welfare. A Russian airbase in Haifa remains operational, providing logistical support to the ARF's efforts in Syria and maintaining a strategic presence for Russia in the eastern Mediterranean. However, the standard of living for civilians in northern Palestine continues to deteriorate, with the area resembling a modern-day Lebanon, deeply scarred by decades of conflict. Meanwhile, in southern Palestine, the PUSG continues to struggle with corruption and inefficiency, leaving the region underdeveloped and vulnerable. Despite its recognition by the UN and continued Western aid, the PUSG fails to create a stable or prosperous state. The southern territories, including Jaffa, Ramla, and Lod, remain heavily militarized, with the PUSG focusing on defense rather than reconstruction. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, the PUSG remains politically fragmented, with internal divisions preventing it from pursuing meaningful development. The Sunni factions within the government often clash over policy decisions, with some leaders advocating for stronger ties with Western powers, while others push for a more nationalist agenda. These internal conflicts prevent the PUSG from effectively governing, and the southern territories continue to languish in poverty and political instability. It's often compared to modern-day Pakistan, but in the Middle East. Despite the ongoing conflicts with the ARF to the north, the PUSG does not engage in any major military campaigns during the 2010s. The wars of the 1980s and 1990s have left the region drained, and the PUSG's military is significantly weakened. As a result, the PUSG adopts a more defensive posture, relying on Jordanian and Egyptian support to maintain its borders. Christian communities in southern Palestine continue to decline throughout the 2000s and 2010s, facing persecution from Sunni factions within the PUSG and a lack of protection from the government. Many Christians flee the region, seeking refuge in Jordan or Europe. By the 2010s, the Christian presence in southern Palestine is negligible, with only a few isolated communities remaining. In contrast to the instability and poverty of the north and south, the West Bank under Jordanian rule flourishes throughout the 2000s and 2010s. Jordan, having maintained control of the West Bank since the 1940s, emerges as one of the most stable and prosperous nations in the Middle East. The West Bank becomes a hub for religious tourism, with Christians and Jews flocking to Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Jericho to visit the holy sites. The Jordanian government encourages this religious tourism, developing infrastructure to support the influx of pilgrims and visitors. Jewish pilgrims, who had been banned from most of Palestine since the conflicts of the mid-20th century, are allowed to visit the West Bank under heavy security. This policy of religious tolerance sets Jordan apart from both the ARF-controlled north and the PUSG in the south, where Jewish visitors are not welcome. Economically, the West Bank thrives under Jordanian administration. Amman fosters close ties with Western powers, especially the United States, which views Jordan as a critical ally in maintaining stability in the region. With US aid and support, Jordan invests heavily in infrastructure, education, and tourism. The West Bank benefits from this investment, becoming a peaceful and well-developed region compared to its neighbors. Jordan's monarchy under King Abdullah II emerges as a key player in Middle Eastern politics, championing moderation and stability. Gaza, under Egyptian control, experiences moderate but significant growth during the 2000s and 2010s, although it does not reach the level of prosperity seen in the West Bank. With Egypt prioritizing stability in the region, Gaza undergoes a more structured development compared to southern Palestine and northern Palestine. While security concerns still dominate, especially along the borders with southern Palestine and the ARF, Egypt invests more heavily in Gaza's infrastructure, modernizing key sectors like education, healthcare, and public services. Though militarization remains a central focus, Egypt recognizes the need for economic progress to maintain internal stability in Gaza. The Gaza Strip, benefiting from its strategic coastal location, becomes a hub for trade and small-scale industry. Egypt opens up trade routes through Gaza's ports, facilitating limited international trade that helps boost the local economy. Investment in transport infrastructure, such as roads and rail connections with Egypt, also improves the flow of goods and people, giving Gaza greater access to Egyptian markets. By the mid-2010s, Gaza's urban centers such as Gaza City see improvements in public services, with modern hospitals, schools, and even small business sectors developing. Tourism, while not a major industry, sees a slight increase as Egypt promotes Gaza's coastal areas for regional tourists from Egypt and neighboring countries. However, foreign tourists remain wary due to the ongoing conflicts in Palestine, and Jewish and Christian visitors avoid the region altogether due to political sensitivities. Egyptian leadership also encourages housing projects and rebuilding efforts, focusing on creating more livable conditions for Gaza's population. However, despite these efforts, Gaza still lags behind the West Bank in overall prosperity. While Egypt's investments in military infrastructure ensure strong border security against ARF excursions and PUSG instability, these priorities limit Gaza's full potential for development. No Jewish population remains in Gaza, and while the Christian community still faces marginalization, they experience more tolerance under Egyptian governance than in southern Palestine. The Christian population continues to dwindle, but Egyptian authorities allow them to maintain their places of worship and religious practices, though with limited political and social influence. By the late 2010s, Gaza stands as a relatively stable yet modestly developed region. It has grown economically under Egyptian control, benefiting from trade routes and government investment. However, the region remains heavily militarized, with Egyptian forces ensuring that security remains a top priority in the face of ongoing tensions with southern Palestine and potential threats from the ARF to the north. By the 2020s, the divisions between northern Palestine, southern Palestine, the West Bank under Jordan, and Gaza under Egypt are deeply entrenched. Northern Palestine, controlled by the ARF, remains heavily militarized and impoverished, with support from Iran and involvement in the Syrian civil war. Economic development is minimal, and the region is war-torn, resembling a modern-day Lebanon. Southern Palestine continues to struggle with corruption and internal divisions, leaving the region stagnant and underdeveloped, akin to modern-day Pakistan. Despite Western aid, little progress is made, and Christian communities all but disappear. The West Bank, under Jordanian rule, flourishes as a stable and prosperous region, boosted by religious tourism and US aid. Jordan emerges as a key ally of the West, promoting peace and religious tolerance. Gaza, under Egypt, sees modest growth, focusing on trade and military security. While more stable than southern Palestine, it lags behind the West Bank in development. And that is where we leave it off for this alternative reality without the state of Israel. I hope you enjoyed exploring this alternate history and imagining what the Middle East might have looked like in a world without Israel. Sometimes looking at these what-ifs helps us understand the complexities of the world we live in today and what different paths could have led to. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, hit that like button, and share your thoughts in the comment section down below. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.